Geno Smith is the starter of the Seattle Seahawks until he's not. Now, that seems like an obvious thing to say. It seems like an obvious course of action. And it is. And that's what Seahawks GM John Schneider said. He was asked about the quarterback situation multiple times, and he has been, and he's obviously at the NFL Combine right now. And he said he's our starter until he's not. But on top of that, there are reports that he's been informed he will be on the roster on his current contract in 2024. So, is Geno going to be the starting quarterback next year? In my opinion, absolutely. 100% will be the quarterback next year. Now, why does John Schneider have to make it a broad statement, right? One, he is the GM of the team. His job is not to only just talk up his guys, right? He's supposed to leave some speculation. He's the guy who's drafting, right? You want other teams to have some sense of, maybe we need a trade for that 16th pick when there's a quarterback like Bo Nix right there, and he's the team 17th team is considering it. Pick 17 is considering it, or pick 18 is considering it. Do we have to trade up with the Seahawks if they're potentially going to take the guy we want? You have to have some open-endedness. And on top of it all, I do believe the Seahawks, and the reason John Schneider says he's our quarterback until he's not, I do believe they are looking at the situation of what's to come next. One thing we cannot forget is that John Schneider comes from the Green Bay Packers, right? And he mentioned this. This is a Greg Bell article from the News Tribune. He's at the Combine. He's always locked in. And one thing that was brought up is the fact that we have drafted only, who was it? We drafted Russell Wilson in 2012 in the 3rd round, and Alex Magoo, whoever, from Florida International in the 7th round in 2018. And that's it. And John Schneider has been talking about this, bringing up himself unsolicited. He's been talking about it for more than 6 years. And he did it again this year. He said, I've told you guys in the past, this is from John Schneider, the GM of the Seahawks, having grown up in the Packers organization, Ron Wolf, 14 drafts, and only he was growing up with Ron Wolf, the 1990s Green Bay Packers GM. Only drafting 2 quarterbacks is not something we've necessarily been proud of. It's just happened that way. Every year, it's a goal to acquire a quarterback, whether that's draft free agency, whatever it looks like. That's interesting for your GM to say. Now, obviously, he comes from the organization that drafted. When Brett Favre was the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, they drafted Craig Nail in 2002. They went ahead and drafted Aaron Rodgers in 2005. When they had Aaron Rodgers, they drafted Matt Flynn in 2018. Now, they took a big hiatus for a while at that point and went and got Jordan Love in 2020 and eventually did replace Aaron Rodgers with Jordan Love. They kind of made the decision. They made it together in some ways, so to say. But it is something that has been talked about. Now, you're talking about a GM that grew up in that organization saying, how are we sitting here and we're not drafting quarterbacks? He literally, quote unquote, said, we're not necessarily proud of the fact we've only drafted 2 quarterbacks in the last 10 years. So he obviously is interested in it. And remember, Geno Smith is the guy right now. Because if you're asking me, do I think Geno Smith should be the guy? Absolutely. He has 1 year remaining on his 3-year, $75 million contract. And it's the guy. Like, he's going to be better than a rookie we get at the 16th pick. So he is the starter until he's not, is a understandable statement considering that Geno Smith will turn 34 during the season. He has 1 year left on this deal. And he's the quarterback right now until he's not. And John Schneider likes to draft quarterbacks. He hasn't been doing it. And part of the reason he probably hasn't been doing it is we have to remember it's been very publicly known that Pete Carroll had final say on personnel decisions when he was there. Or they had a final say together, let's say. John Schneider has a final say now. And he wants to have more quarterback options. Now, do we know if that's going to be a J.J. McCarthy or a Michael Penix Jr.? or somebody like that. We're not 100% sure yet, which is why I wanted to go through the names. Now, there's 3 guys I don't think the Seahawks will get no matter what happens unless we trade our future for them, which we're not going to do in a season where we're not 100% sure what. Yeah, well, we're not. John Schneider's it's not his first rodeo. He's not going to trade away the future for an unknown quarterback, even though they're great. But we're not going to get Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, or Drake May. They're ranked number 2 in the draft, number 5 in the draft, number 6 in the draft. Most people would actually say Caleb's number 1. I'm just going off CBS's prospect rankings at quarterback. We're not getting Caleb Williams no matter what happens on this earth unless we send 5 first-round picks. We're not getting Jaden Daniels. We're not getting Drake May. Now, this leaves us probably at a few options. And I'm going to ignore, there's obviously a lot of guys that enter the draft, right? You have Tua's brother at ranked 217. You have Spencer Sanders from Ole Miss at 209. And you have 10 other guys there. But I'm going to go up these top like 8, 9 guys. Because after those 3, ranked number 18, we have the 16th pick this year, is J.J. McCarthy from Michigan. I know what you're saying. Oh, J.J. McCarthy. We don't want J.J. McCarthy. This. I actually tend to agree. Now, if they draft him, I'm going to believe in him because that's what our organization does. They make a lot of the right picks, and I wouldn't doubt them too much when it comes to, taking a swing for the future, somebody that can learn behind Geno Smith. And that's what it would be. But J.J. McCarthy has a lot of connections. Don't forget, Mike McDonald came from Michigan. I know he was with the Ravens last couple of years, but he came from Michigan. John Harbaugh's son, is now on the Seahawks. He's the special teams coach of the Seahawks now. There are a lot of connections. I've talked about this in a previous video on Seattle on Tap, our podcast page. It's all Seahawks. This channel, my personal channel, Sammy on Tap, I do some NFL in total and Seahawks. If you love just Seahawks football, you got to check out Seattle on Tap. Links in the description. That's where our podcast is with me and my brother. We have some big guests coming up, like some really good ones. And we do all Seahawks videos. But I made a video there about the Seahawks coaches not being at the combine. And part of the reason, and I brought this up, is they have multiple Michigan guys. Michigan put out the most players in the draft in history, 18 in the draft combine. And number 2 this year was Washington, I think, at 14. We have Ryan Grubb now. Interesting, right? The offensive coordinator from the Huskies. And UW's down the street. So we also have the Michigan connections. So J.J. McCarthy's at 18. There's connections there. And then at 27, the next quarterback on the list is Michael Penix Jr. Those are 2 guys that we have a lot of connections. Ryan Grubb obviously was the offensive coordinator for Michael Penix, and it was down the street at University of Washington in Montlake. And I know it's not down the street. I say this every time. I know it's one's in Renton practice facility in downtown Seattle for the games, and one's in Montlake, whatever. You know my point. They're both across the bridge on a certain part of Seattle. Stadium and, UW at least. There is a chance that those 2 guys are a very big possibility. And they're both guys that you might understand that could wait behind Geno for a year or 2. And I know people make fun of Michael Penix's age. Dude's like 24. I think he's turning 25. He's not that old, okay? Let's just remember a lot of really good quarterbacks in history had to either wait behind somebody like Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes. They both waited a year or 2 or more. And a lot of these guys have to play 4 years in college. The age is not a problem. If you're a good quarterback and you can have a good quarterback for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, that's what matters in the NFL. J.J. McCarthy and Michael Penix are very possible opportunities. But those are guys that you probably have to take with that 16th pick in the draft. Then you start to get to Bo Nix from Oregon at 37. Something that I know they would consider, like they would consider it, right? He's a decent prospect. He's ranked 37th. Maybe that's a second-round pick. I don't know how high. You never know with quarterbacks how much it moves during draft day or how much expectations move for a guy. But then you start getting into the 70s where you can start getting that second-round, third-round guy. Spencer Rattler from South Carolina. He was a huge prospect out of high school. Kind of, dwindled down, didn't have the best years. I think it was Oklahoma, then South Carolina. He's at 71. And then 78, Michael Pratt from Tulane, who said himself at the combine when he talked about he interviewed with the Seahawks. He said that he would love to learn behind Geno Smith. Like, he was asked a question about it. So he was openly talking about the fact that he would sit behind Geno Smith and would love to, get mentored by Geno Smith until the position becomes his. And that's what you need out of a guy, right? A guy like Michael Pratt, who you're not going to use your 16th pick, but you might use a second-round pick on him. Like, he drafted 70-something overall, and he sits behind Geno for a year or two, whatever it ends up being, and then you see what happens. You go on, you have Jordan Travis, who's coming off that devastating injury that he had from Florida State at 136, and Gavin Hardison from UTEP at 149, and then you have a bunch of guys moving forward. Now, the reason I know the Seahawks are not going to go ahead and, humbly, this is what I believe at least, they're not going to go ahead and try to trade up for like a Drake May. And even if they go for somebody like J.J. McCarthy, they'll probably let Geno be the guy for another year. Geno Smith last year, in passing grades on PFF, was 13th in the NFL. Well, actually, that's without minimum dropbacks, because Kyle Trask had one game. Geno Smith was 12th in passing. 12th puts him behind Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, Jordan Love, Jalen Hurts, Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, Mahomes, Stafford, Prescott, Allen, Tua. He was ahead of, in the games that he played, Brock Purdy, C.J. Stroud, Trevor Lawrence, Derek Carr, Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, Jake Browning, who had a good 9 games, Tyrod Taylor, Russell Wilson. In a whole offensive grade, if you include the run game, which he had a lower score last year, he was still 14th in the NFL. The only people that passed him were C.J. Stroud, went ahead of him instead of, he went from 12 to, Brock Purdy went up to, he was number 1 in running. So overall offense, Purdy goes up to 6 and CJ Stroud goes up to 13, but Geno stays at 14. So he's in the top half of quarterbacks, whether it's just passing grades or overall quarterback grade with rushing and passing involved. So Geno Smith's a good quarterback. Do not get it twisted. He's especially good enough to keep your team at a 9-10 win, feel, especially for a first-year head coach. That's going to be important, that this does not become a season where we lose too many games or we end up in a situation where it's really tough for the first-year coach to, get out of a lot of issues with a young quarterback. So they're going to keep Geno Smith around, but I'm saying keep your eye out for J.J. McCarthy, whether you like it or not. Michael Penix, Bo Nix. These are my 4. I'm going to go. This is my likelihood, actually. This is what I'm going to go. Actually, likelihood, I'm going to go number 1, Michael Pratt from Tulane in the 2nd or 3rd round, wherever it ends up being. My number 2 possibility, I'm going to put Michael Penix Jr. Number 3, I'm going to put J.J. McCarthy. Number 4, I'm going to say Bo Nix is a possibility. And last but not least, I think Spencer Rattler could be a sneaky one at 5. Those are the guys. I think it's going to go somewhere between the 1st and 3rd round. They're going to take that quarterback. They're going to tell Geno, it's your team. Don't worry. And Geno's a good teammate. You saw how he acted when Drew Lock played really good against the Eagles last year. He had his back. He was hyped to see him do well. They're going to draft a quarterback. And they're going to let him sit behind Geno for a year or two until otherwise. And that's why Geno Smith's the starter until he's not. Fair enough to me. We'll see. Comment below, what do you think the Seahawks should do, and what do you think they're going to do? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I love y'all, and I'll be back, as always, another day, probably by Monday. So enjoy, and I'll see you soon.